Thank you so much for joining our workshop today on how will intelligent chatbots and IVRs change your contact center. Our speaker today is David Atwater, Senior Scientist with TalkMap. Before we start the event, a few housekeeping issues. We'll have some questions at the end. Please feel free to use the Q&A button at any time in the middle of the Zoom interface to send us questions. We'll have a number of polls during the event. Please do answer those and we'll share back the results with everyone. And if you have any technical questions or problems with the webinar, please use the chat button to let me know. And now over to David Atwater, Senior Scientist at TalkMap.
Okay, thank you, Justin. This is the third in a series of talks where we look at the role of large language models in conversational analytics and all sorts of interesting topics around that. The first two sessions, we looked at Gen AI and the underlying technology of large language models. In the second one, we explored the specific characteristics of spoken and written conversation and why is conversational analytics so challenging and how do large language models help you solve some of those challenging problems. In this session, we're going to take a look at chatbots and IVR in regard to their contact impact, in regard to their impact on the contact center. And we're also going to look a little bit about what the current state of the art is and where we might be heading with chatbots and IVRs. Then there's a couple more coming up in the series, one looking at summaries, and then finally we're going to look at risk with relation to Gen AI. So, topics for today. Well, first of all, I'm going to recap those first two sessions that I mentioned, just for those of you who didn't see those first two sessions, and also just to lay a bit of foundation for some of the things we're going to talk about today. Then we're going to talk about channels. Why do people choose to talk or type as opposed to use visual user interfaces? Then we're going to talk a little bit about why automation, and basically it saves cost, you all know that, but we'll explore that in a little bit more detail. Then we're going to spend some time on chatbots and IVR and the different generations of user interface styles and or technology. So we'll explore all the way through from simple touchtone right the way through to some of the emerging language model based technologies. And then finally, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk about the impact on the contact center. And I'm going to assert that we're looking at evolution in terms of the impact of new generation IVR and chatbots on the contact center rather than a revolution. So we'll come to that later. So first of all, let's just do some recap. We asked ourselves in fact, the second session, what's so special about conversation? And one of the things that we talked about was the fact that it emerges kind of out of nowhere and is formed in the brains of the people who are holding the conversation. So these two people are talking. They both have some basic understanding of the world and maybe what it is that they're engaging in conversation about. But they then have their own private thoughts. You know, I think this, or I want this, and I think this, and I want this. And then they also are forming views as they're conversing about what the other person thinks. So step by step, turn by turn, I think he thinks I think, and then it actually goes up and up and up as we looked at in the last session. And then we can think about what we think about other people thinking about things, etc. Well, why is this important? Well, it actually affects the way that conversation evolves. And as we looked at in the previous session, we saw that it means there's quite a lot of information that isn't in a conversation because it's actually just in the heads of the people who are holding the conversation. We also then took a look at contact center conversations, and we looked at the asymmetry of those conversations. It's not just two people having a social chat. We have a customer who is initiating contact usually, and then we have an agent who is then responding to that need. The positions of the two conversants are different. The initiator of the conversation has lived experience of the problem they're trying to deal with, whereas the agent has no understanding of essentially their social or lived experience, but they do understand the policy and procedure. That leads to differences in social power and procedural power. So the customer has very high power in the conversation because they're the customer, but the agent actually is the person who can make things happen. So they have very high procedural power. So this becomes asymmetric. So what this leads to is in a contact center conversation, there's a social contract between the customer and the agent when it's going well, and the customer has to trust that the agent has the correct knowledge. and also that the agent is essentially going to adopt their goal and help them achieve their goal. So that's when it's going well. That asymmetry leads to conversations that often follow a similar pattern. So we see a conversation here. It starts with the problem specification. My internet's been running very slowly. Then it moves into some kind of diagnosis or fact-finding phase. You'll see the problem specification is customer initiated. Then the diagnosis and the fact-finding phase is generally agent-led because they have the procedural knowledge to take on the customer's problem. And then finally, if it goes well, there's some kind of solution. Now, this structure is important because it also reflects on the structure of an interaction with a bot or an IVR, where the very start of a bot or IVR conversation, the customer will be taking initiative, but then due to this asymmetry again of the social contract, because the contract with the bot is very similar to the contract with the agent, the bot will take initiative. That affects essentially what you can do with the bot and the sorts of technologies you need to help customers achieve their goals. So we'll come on to that a little bit later. Just finishing off our recap. In the very first session, we talked about large language models. This is just a single slide to remind ourselves of what large language models are. We reached back into the 1960s where language scientists started looking at just simple statistical models of which words follow other words. But then if we add on a number of innovations that have happened since the 1960s, we have deep learning and neural networks, that's artificial brain cells to you and me. The graphic processing units, just an enormous growth in the ability to do supercomputing, sort of parallel processing, enormous amounts of data from about 2000 onwards as the internet came online and started just becoming huge. And then finally, and very recently, we've seen the innovation that by showing a very, very large language model examples of tasks and questions, the language models has developed the ability to actually interpret instructions and questions and execute them. So it's only when we've added all those things together that we get what we call the large language model. And that's loosely the glue that holds together this talk series, is we're interested in the impact of large language models on contact center technology. Here's an example of how large language models can now perform tasks. So we see at the top, this is what we would enter into the language model. Here's a conversation between a customer and an agent, and then we just have literally cut and pasted a conversation between an agent and a customer. You see it's prefixed, just agent, customer there. And then we ask the language model the question, why did the customer contact customer service? And we see the large language model is responding to an instruction, why did the customer contact, and also understands that they need to provide a summary, and it does. So we see below the customer contacted customer service because they're trying to get their home phone hooked up, but have been unsuccessful despite providing all the necessary information. So that's bringing us up to date with the last two sessions, really, just looking at why is conversation special and interesting, and the underlying technology of large language models, which is the thing that we're focusing on in this series. Excuse me. Which brings us on to the topic for today, which is IVRs and chatbots. It almost brings us on to the topic for today, because before we talk about that, I want to talk about channels. I want to talk about why is it that customers pick up the phone or choose to use typed chat, essentially language, versus, for example, using an app or a web page. So let's just explore that, because it's extremely important as we start to understand how IVRs and chatbots fit into the landscape of customer contact centers. So why is it that customers choose conversational channels? Well, they're choosing them because of the power of language. So language allows you to talk about the things that aren't right in front of you. So for example, with a graphical user interface, all you can really engage with is the buttons and the windows that you've got right in front of you. Whereas language, you can talk about something, you can just talk about anything you want. So it gives you the ability to just discuss freely concepts and ideas. You can put words together to create new meanings. What all that gives you, and that goes back to the uniqueness of language, is it allows you to basically collaboratively solve problems and negotiate with another conversant, usually a person. But in this session, we're going to start thinking about what that looks like when you're interacting with a machine instead of a person. Conversational channel also gives you social connection. There's very little sense that you have been heard or understood at any kind of emotional level when you interact with a website. But somehow language helps you break through that barrier, in particular when you speak with another human being. So that's an important part of customer care, that customers feel heard and are able to express their annoyance. Often becomes an important function of why people choose the conversational channel. And then finally, it's not terribly relevant today, but it's also an eyes-free channel. So essentially it lets you can do things when you're driving, for example. So here's an example of a conversation in a conversational channel. The conversation starts with the customer saying, I paid my bill, but I'm still suspended. So you see they're expressing here, they can basically describe a problem. So they don't know the solution, they just describe a problem. We see here now that the agent can say, I'm sorry to hear that. And then they can express expectations of what they're going to do for the customer. So we've got some of the social connection and also the social contract. We looked at this in the previous session. And then we can see that the agent is essentially helping them solve a problem. I can see what happened. They're giving them information. Your bill payment is this, but in fact, you had a late payment fee of $12, which means that your account still past you and therefore you've not been unsuspended. Now, it's pretty hard for a graphical user interface to express that sort of information, and language is really powerful for that. And then, of course, we get to the next bit where this customer's not happy, and we're moving into negotiations. So we've seen that language is good for solving problems, it's good for negotiating, good for social connection, and then we've already talked about the eyes-free situation. Okay, let's just talk about visual channels now. Why would people choose to essentially to go to a web page rather than pick up the phone or use some kind of web chat? And it's a number of different things here. It's immediate, it's high bandwidth, it's the relatively low social demand, and it's persistence. So here's an example of a visual channel. I've deliberately stayed away from technology for now. I've stuck with paper because it's not just a technology discussion, this. Why would you choose visual channels to basically satisfy your needs? Well, one thing is that it's immediate, and that is more a technology thing, but it's high bandwidth. You can see on the left that when a person or a machine has to say, your latest bill value was this, and you got a late payment, and it was that, it actually takes time. And it's also ephemeral. It's only available in your short-term memory if it's not actually on screen. Whereas with a visual channel, extremely high bandwidth, I can scan with my eye and I can search for the transaction I'm interested in, I can whiz across and I can check the balance related with it, I can think, oh, I wonder what the date was, my eye can scan back again. So the power of visual channels is this, that it's immediate, high bandwidth. There's very little social interaction or social demand here. It's more an informational channel, and very importantly, it's persistent. So we're not taxing our short-term memory when we're using visual channels. So that's something about the nature of the channels. A little later, we're going to tie this together and look at customer channel choice, IVRs and bots, and how that then relates to things like the visual channels, apps, and web pages, and sort of stitch it all together a little bit. So the next question we're going to ask is, why would you have automation? Well, this is a bit of a no-brainer, so I'm not going to take a lot of time on this. So let's just start over from a sort of customer and company perspective. Why would you essentially prefer to speak with a person rather than speak with a machine? And it's because essentially agents here mean people, are intelligent, they're empathetic, and they're extremely flexible. All the reasons why you would want to pick up the phone and speak to an actual person. So why does automation even exist? Well, it's kind of obvious. By bots, I mean IVRs and chatbots. They're cheap. That's the obvious driver. Notice that's a driver for the enterprise. That's not a direct benefit to the customer. But they're also reliable, and this is a little bit more of a benefit to the customers. Essentially, they give the same answer every time. They follow the same procedure every time. they don't stray outside of what they've essentially been taught is the correct way to do things. And that can be a benefit to customers, and it's certainly a benefit to the agents when it comes to things like compliance. So let's now go back to the channels and talk about automation. So we've got automation on the chat language channels, and that's IVR for voice and chatbot for visual chat, so typed text essentially. And then on the visual side of things, we've got graphical user interfaces, so we've got apps and web. So let's now just think about self-service automation. This looks obviously amazingly like the slide we've just seen, but we're thinking specifically now about speaking with a machine. So here we have a conversation with a machine. This is a conversation that current generation spoken IVRs are capable of holding, and we'll come on to absolute state of the art later, or bleeding edge later. So we've got machine take initiative. We've got the ability now for callers to use a measure of natural language to describe a problem. So we've got that problem specification that you get from language. We've got somewhat stilted response here. We're following a script, and we'll come on to this a little bit later. You want to discuss a suspended account. We've got the yes here. And then we've got, some informational self-service here. I see your account is currently suspended due to a past due amount of $12. That may or may not be responding to the customer's needs. So one of the things we see with current day IVR and chatbot technology is that we're kind of playing a numbers game. We're trying to guess what's the most useful thing I could say at this point that might mean that this particular customer doesn't actually need to go and speak to an agent. And then we might follow on with some options. Do you want to make a payment? Here, recent transactions, or discuss a bill. So let's ask ourselves, how much of the need of the channel is the IVR or the chatbot actually fulfilling here? Well, solving problems, yes, to some degree. So I'm going to give it a little tick. So we're essentially trying to hit what's the most common problem that someone who expresses this might have, and we're trying to offer it, sort of head them off at the pass before they head to the person. But it's not real sentient problem solving. Negotiation, no, there's not really any option of negotiation, although you can use IVRs to negotiate things like promises to pay and things like that, as long as they're highly structured negotiations, but generally no. Social connection, no. I'm slightly at odds with the IVR and voice community who believe that you can use machines to form social relationships with customers by nice voices and nice jingly music and all that kind of stuff, but I don't believe it. After 20 years working with customers and IVRs, they almost never end up with any kind of warm, fuzzy social feeling about talking to a machine. And then eyes free, yeah, we kind of get that for free. So let's think now about the graphical user interface, so apps and web. So I brought up my app, and I'm using it to do customer service. And what am I getting from this? Well, it's absolutely immediate. As we talked about earlier, I can scan my different accounts. I can see the different account values here, high bandwidth, high information. I don't get much chance to use this interface to express my social need. I don't get to complain or moan or feel I've been listened to. But it's extremely persistent. I can go back to it. I can pop it up whenever I want it, etc. So what is an interesting question is, to what extent is the IVR chatbot satisfying the need of the voice channel? And as we've seen, it kind of isn't. To a large degree, what the IVR is doing, or the chatbot is doing, is providing the things that the graphical user interface could provide. There's very little on this left-hand side that is being provided that actually a customer couldn't essentially self-serve through this user interface. And that's pretty important because it underpins some of the move away, trying to move customers away from direct voice channels and move them into digital channels. And what essentially is happening is that if that movement is successful, and many companies are now being very successful, some of them don't even support voice channels particularly, what that's essentially doing is shrinking down the role of the IVR in the contact center. Because if you've transitioned all of your customers across to solve their informational needs using a graphical user interface, the chatbot starts to lose its effectiveness to be able to actually deliver value in the journey that a customer has through the voice channel, because what they really want to do is they really want to solve problems, and they really want to negotiate, and they really want social connection. So that kind of explains why, as the digital channels have risen, IVRs in particular have become less and less sexy. They've had less and less funding. They've had less and less attention. There's been more attention on chatbots, and the reason is, of course, because of the attention on the digital channels. But one of the things we've noticed is that chatbots have not become immensely popular. So as you see a huge transition over to digital, you've not seen a massive uptick in the movement of customers away from voice channels towards chatbot channels. And the reason is because of all this stuff down here. Voice is actually just better at doing this stuff than typing is a lot of the time. And people are going for their digital channels because they're using them for their informational needs, not for their problem-solving needs. Okay, so let's move on now and just look at the different generations of technology with IVRs and chatbots. And I'm working towards where might we be going in terms of language technology, and how that might affect the ability to deal with some of these things on the left-hand side, such as problem solving and negotiation. So let's just think about IVRs and chatbots. I'm going to sort of deal with them together, but I'm going to flip between the two, because IVR is essentially the voice channel equivalent of the typed chatbot. So let's just start off with what I'm calling tree-based options. I'm gathering together a lot of generations of technology here, but I'm thinking this is the menu tree, essentially. The structured conversation, I offer them a number of options. I ask them a question. Now I do this, now I do that. It's all codified. In the voice IVR world, and again, I've mixed speech and touch tone here just to show that they're kind of part of the same equation here. But we end up with interactions like this. Thank you for calling Acme. Please say or enter your 8-digit account number. Then we've got an entry, your PIN. We've got a number. You now have 3 choices, and then this particular user interface is offering speech here. To hear your balance, say balance. Hear your transaction, say transactions. Anything else, say operator. They say operator, and they get routed. So you will all be familiar with this as the sort of underpinning paradigm of the IVR. Touch tone equivalents of this started coming out in the 1980s, but this is still in many ways the underlying paradigm of voice systems that you will interact with now when you place a phone call to a contact center. You go over into the graphical user interface app world, chatbot world, and it's not a lot different. So it wouldn't be surprising to end up with a chatbot conversation like this. I've mirrored the identification and validation. All of that may well have happened through a different, that may well have happened through logging into a website, for example, but just to show you the same patterns. We can ask questions, the user can now type the answers. And it's extremely common in current day chatbots to see menu items being presented to customers, and it actually works extremely well. Remember, with the visual channel, we've got this persistence and the immediacy, so we can scan the options we're choosing from and choose and click them. So even this, though this is a user interface technology that dates back to the 1980s, it's still highly relevant to create functional user interfaces within chatbots that are performing not really problem solving or negotiation, but they're performing basic informational need requirements. So let's now move through. Actually, sorry, let's just go and take a look at how that then stacks up against our sort of channel guide. And what you can see is with tree-based options, we're not really serving the sorts of things that customers need to get out of their conversational channel. It's more suited to a visual channel, which is why it sits actually very nicely in the chatbot world, where you do actually have the benefits of language and a visual channel. Let's now look at the next generation of technology, which I'm calling example-based natural language. This is really, if you are interacting with a chatbot with a contact center now, or you have called up a contact center and you have a relatively advanced system that says, for example, how may I help you? Then you're going to be using this generation of technology, which I'm calling example-based natural language. It's really just an innovation on top of the structured patterns. So you can see here the tree-based approach at the start, but then we essentially break out into these areas where we can say, how can I help you? And there could be not just 3 or 4 options available. There could be hundreds of, let's call them options, available, but they're available by allowing the customer to use language. So we can see here on the right-hand side, we've got, how can I help you today? The customer says, I want to know my balance. So they're using natural language. Then the machine essentially takes that sentence from the customer, I want to know my balance, and compares it against example sentences. On the left here, you'll see I've just given 4. Balance, I need my balance, please give me a balance, what's in my account. There are different ways that people might express it. And if it's pretty close to that, it will then do what we call classify it as a balance inquiry, and then it will move on to the balance module. But you can see here, because you don't have to give options to the user, we can support hundreds or even thousands of options in the background. And this is pretty much where we are right now in your big contact center technology stack. Is many of them will be doing this. If we move on now and just look at the bot equivalent, exactly the same thing is going on now in the bots that you'll be interacting with when you're accessing a bot through a website, etc. You'll see here the bot may ask open questions like, what do you need help with? You can then express things in open language, like I have an unrecognized transaction, and then the bot can move on and ask follow-on questions. How much is the transaction, etc. You'll notice in these 2 examples, I had the IVR saying, say I enter the amount. It's an unrecognized transaction. Say I enter the amount, I'll say I don't know. And they said it's $47 from Amazon. It's pretty typical in the IVR world at the moment for these answers to actually be quite brittle. They're what we call grammar driven. So if you move outside of just giving a dollar amount there, you could run into trouble with the system. Generally speaking, on the text-based systems, they're more robust. It's they're more robust to you being able to present, for example, additional pieces of information. So in this case, you'll see I've shown the technology coping with an utterance like $37.60 from Amazon. But this is still a structured interaction. It's not capable of holding negotiation. It's not capable of reasoning. It's not really capable of any kind of significant problem solving. Everything still has to be codified. So where does that sit then in our world of suitability for channels? Well, essentially what's happened is by allowing customers to now say clearly what it is that they have a problem with, we've nibbled off a little bit of the front end of the problem for negotiation and problem solving. And really all we've done is we've allowed the machine to correctly identify what it is that the customer is calling about so they can get to the right skill. And in that sense, we've improved their chances of having successful negotiation or solving a problem. So that's why I've left these as crosses, but I've turned them green, just to say it's still not doing it for you, but it is facilitating it to some degree in the journey towards a human agent. Everything else remains pretty much the same. We haven't added an awful lot. So this is kind of where we are right now in example-based NL in the middle here. So finally, I want to talk about where we're going next. What's kind of coming over the hill? What technologies are we seeing emerging that are being built on large language models technology? So I've made a bit of a fictitious example of how you might start to build some kind of large language model based chatbot for essentially I've stayed in the banking domain just because we've been talking about it. And you'll see here that this is a more kind of the chatbot is going to be built on top of a general purpose language model. So the general purpose language model can hold conversation about almost anything. You can ask it about the weather, or to give you a definition of a certain type of flower. I mean, it knows so much, the large language models. So the current large players in this space are providing the facility to customize that general purpose language model chat solution with your own information. And they're beginning to look a bit like this. And we're seeing an awful lot of products coming out built on top of these frameworks, and many of them are just essentially bootstrapping up off the big players, facilities that they're providing under the hood. And so you get to have your own named agent. You then get to give it a measure of instructions, so you can tell it, in here we've got a generic instruction, but you can also give it specific instructions about how it should respond to certain types of questions, how it should treat customers, etc., etc. And then we're starting to see some new paradigms emerging that are quite close to the example-based NL, but are just way more open in terms of the way that the AI is going to respond to them. So the first is what's called integrations. And this is very much like the example-based, where essentially we've said that we've got a number of islands of meaning here, people talking about balances and recent transactions, and we're going to associate them with a function of dialogue, essentially a coded conversational function. That's what we do now. So we move forward. Let's get through this slide. So we move forward here. What we actually get to do is we just get to associate islands of meaning, but again, we really only have to use a single phrase. So for example, we can say, I want to know my balance. Because it's a large language model, it doesn't need to be told lots of different ways of saying that. It just kind of can infer all sorts of different ways of talking about that now. And then you associate that with a back-end piece of code that will bring back the balance. You don't really have to tell it a lot more. So you don't have to code all the dialogue that goes with it. You just literally bring back the information. Same might be true for recent transactions. You might bring back some textual information. You might bring back an image, etc. So we're going another layer of abstraction away from having to say how the conversation is going, to saying, if they want to talk about this, then they're going to want to know this information, and leave the large language model to essentially piece it all together and generate the language. Another thing you can do very effectively with large language models is essentially provide them with little knowledge articles. So I've made some up here. They listed 2024 interest rates, changes to terms and conditions, and just by literally feeding them into this custom chatbot, you kind of empower the chatbot to realize that when customers are talking about these topics, they're going to head towards these articles, and they're going to use them as a basis for presenting information. But you'll see here, there'll be more under the hood than what I'm showing you here, but not an enormous amount more in terms of telling the agent how to behave or what to say. And as a result, we get much more variable behavior out of chatbots that are like this. So let's look at an example of how this might look now. So this is the Acme Retail Banking Assistant. I need help with my account. We get some kind of generic response back here. There's no specifics. I can help with many aspects of your banking needs. What help do you need? So it may be drawing, for example, from those underlying instructions which say you're a helpful assistant who knows how to help with, well, here we see it, you're a helpful banking assistant. So it might be drawing from that to push forward the conversation, but it's not been told by any designer that those are the words it should use. There's a transaction I don't recognize, blah, blah, blah. You'll see that will trigger some kind of integration, maybe a transaction lookup integration, which pulls back the data. But then the large language model is essentially making up as it goes along. It starts to render that information in forms that you would understand. Then we might ask for an action that is outside the scope, and we may well have essentially had an integration or a knowledge base that helps the large language model chat system to understand that that is outside of its scope. And I would expect that there will be quite specific integrations into those journeys into the agent skill base. So this conversation looks and feels an awful lot like the ones we just showed you, but the difference is that they're being sort of declared rather than explicitly designed. And because of that, they can be built faster, they can have more functionality, but the designer has less control over how they behave. So let's just pull together how that might look in our chart here with the custom LLM. We see now that really we are starting to have the opportunity to solve problems. If it can read knowledge articles, and if we can interact with the content in those knowledge articles, we've got a good chance now we can actually use them to solve problems. We're probably not going to be doing much more negotiation than we might have been able to do with a codified system, because negotiation involves generally pretty detailed understanding of underlying business rules and quite a lot of compliance issues. So it maybe that turns into a tick, but for now I'm leaving it as a green cross. I don't believe that these extra features will increase sense of social connection. I think that customers will still very clearly understand they're talking with a machine. This is a personal belief, that other people might disagree, but it might start nudging us towards some of the benefits of responding to people's social emotional needs through using language, and then everything else remains pretty much the same. So let's just kind of draw all that together. What can IVRs and chatbots really do for your enterprise? Well, this is kind of bread and butter. Any of you who are operating IVRs and chatbots know this, but they can reduce count and head count. They can remove routine, simple fact-based inquiries. They can increase consistency in some areas, and they can really increase the likelihood of a customer being handled by the correct skill. So that's the benefits to the enterprise. There's not enormous amount of benefits for customers. They get 24-hour access to simple information, and it gives them increased likelihood that an agent will have the correct skills. But in a like-to-like comparison between the customer having their inquiry dealt with by a real life person in the same time frame as a machine, the machines don't add an enormous amount of extra benefit to customers. So they're really there for the benefit of the enterprise. One extra thing we get with chatbots in the digital channel is it increases the findability of information. So we can type in, I want to know about blah, blah, blah. And then a web page, for example, can bring up a diagram of how to fix your washing machine, or a list of instructions on how to reconnect your router, etc., etc. So they're the underlying drivers that are in this sort of IVR and chatbot space. How are large language models going to change things? Well, if we work under the assumption that some of the benefits that I've spoken about are going to work their way into production IVRs and production chatbots, I certainly believe they're going to make it into production chatbots. I think they'll be a lot slower into production IVRs. Then the main benefit we're going to see is much more specific and personalized treatment of inquiries. So current bots and IVRs classify language into broad buckets. So we have some examples here. I've already paid, but I'm suspended. I think my payment didn't go through. What do I need to do to avoid being suspended? There's a good chance that current bots and IVRs will group those together and say, that's a customer with a suspension problem, and give them generic treatment. Whereas a large language model based chatbots should be able to respond to the exact context of prior conversation and the exact language that's in the phrase. And if this is done well, it could significantly increase trust and engagement with automation to help you try and actually do problem solving using a language channel independent of speaking to a person. So that's potentially an enormous benefit to the enterprise. But it's likely that no two inquiries will look completely alike, whereas now an interaction with an IVR or chatbot are pretty structured, and you can draw sort of graphs and follow individual nodes when you're doing all your analysis. They're going to be hard to follow on these things because the large language model will have so much freedom. So I think what we're actually going to see in terms of the impact on the contact center, if they move towards large language model based bot technology, is they're going to move their expertise away from bot design. They won't have people sat there designing individual prompts and paths and drawing graphs, but they'll have to put a lot more people into the area of bot compliance. How can I be sure it's doing what I want? How can I be sure it's not making offers it shouldn't be making? How can I be sure it's not being rude to customers, et cetera, because you're essentially handing a lot of the control away, and that has branding implications. So there's going to be some very, very interesting, I think, conversations happening around that for enterprises who are thinking of adopting bots, LLM-based bots in the contact center. So the impact on the contact center, essentially, as we take more and more routine stuff away from the voice channels, the agents, then the agents get essentially a more and more complex mix of calls and chats. That's potentially good for them. It's more interesting work, but it also places real demands on the need for experience, paying well, and training and trying to stop staff turnover. Volumes may fall, but one of the interesting things that we've seen with the rapid growth of the digital channels is that volumes into voice channels, generally speaking, go down, but not enormously. So it's almost like the digital channel just stimulates just more activity in general. And so whilst you're getting more complex calls into the contact center, you're still getting the volumes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on that. We've mentioned the move from the bot design to bot assurance. And finally, I just want to mention another trend which I think we're going to see emerging, which is a trend towards bot-assisted agent model. You'll recall when we looked at what the LLM bots are going to give us, they're going to give us a lot of informational support, but again, they're not going to be able to do the actual negotiations and the emotional support. So I want to imagine there are already products that do this in the contact center, but I think they're going to be revolutionized by the large language model chatbot technology. That as the conversation is proceeding, you can essentially have a chatbot that is maybe fronting the conversation, but then may stay in the conversation as the agent takes over. So essentially the chatbot continues to monitor conversation between the agent and the customer once they've handed it over. And then what they might be able to do is provide informational assist to the agent, for example, popping up offers and things like that, which is based on exactly the same models that maybe some of the original chat assistant models are. But the enterprise has made a deliberate decision that at a certain point in the conversation, they want to move a customer over away from a chatbot to a human because they want to get these benefits of the negotiation channel. Essentially joining the large language model bot with the human agent, we can kind of get the best of both worlds. We can get the efficiency on the front end. We then, as we move into a phase where we really do need people, we can use the underlying large language model technology to empower agents with informational support that makes sure that they remain efficient and stay on protocol, but the customer still gets all the benefits of the personal communication and changing. Okay, finally, analytics. I work for a conversational intelligence company. So why have I been talking to you about IVRs and bots at all? Well, because IVRs and bots are an integral part of the end-to-end conversation that a customer has with the enterprise. At the moment, there is usually a separation between the sort of tools you're using to do analytic support inside your bots and your IVRs and that which you might be using in the contact center, which is the area that I spend most of my time working now. When IVR and bot conversations start to be utterly unique, they're going to start looking more and more like human-human conversations, and we're almost certain to see a convergence in the needs for analytics between bots and the human part of the conversation. So I think products such as ours that are solving many of the underlying problems of how do you do analytical insights and benefits from highly complicated, unstructured human-human conversations, you're going to need those tools to also start analyzing the behavior of your bots and meeting the compliance needs and that we've been talking about. Okay, so in summary, customers choose conversational channels to solve problems and negotiate and get personal connections. The current IVR and chat technology is really there to serve the enterprise, not the customer. And it doesn't offer an awful lot more that you can't get from a digital app. So it's really just a channel bolt-on. But it does act as a barrier for customers getting value out of the conversational channel by being between them and people, which of course is why people don't like automation in contact centers. Next generation large language model bots are going to support troubleshooting and search much more effectively, but they're going to still lack the personal connection and the power to negotiate and reason with customers. Therefore, we may well see a transition from the moving over into the boundary of agent support as well as front-end interaction with customers. Okay, that's all I have to say. Coming next in the series, we're going to look at summaries and then we're going to look at the risk of Gen AI. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll now move on and take some questions.
Thank you so much, David. Fascinating presentation. Now I would invite everyone to use the Q&A button in the middle of the Zoom interface to send us some questions. First question, David. I was very interested to hear you say that with AI we will move away from design towards assurance. Do you think that this will apply in areas outside of customer service as well?
The answer is probably a bit beyond my expertise, but it's pretty clear that AI is going to be increasingly embedded in all manner of processes across the enterprise. If we're in a circumstance where we move away from explicitly written rules and allow an AI to essentially execute intuition based on instructions, we're going to hit the assurance problem really quite quickly. The only thing that's really different in the different areas of business is what it is that we're trying to assure. For example, if you use an AI to vet applicants for a job, then we need to assure that there's no bias and that the AI is judging competence. In an IVR context, the assurance is more about making sure the AI is following due process for financial reasons or compliance reasons. I think this is going to be an absolutely huge area in business in general, but in customer care. And it wouldn't surprise me if there isn't a whole industry focused on trying to solve this problem in the near future.
Thanks so much, David. Next question is, you said that in your talk that you thought that advanced conversational analytics were going to be needed to monitor the next generation of bots and AIs. If they also use AI, do we not end up with one AI marking another AI's homework?
That's a brilliant question. The short answer is probably yes. I'm not sure it's going to be a problem, however, for a while. Our conversational analytics platform, for example, uses large language models to help you find patterns and insights into conversation. It doesn't yet make value judgments, so you can't ask it things like, show me all the good conversations this month, for example. Instead, it helps you find out things that follow similar underlying patterns and then spot deviations from those patterns. It's still up to the user to make judgments about the differences. There is a risk that LLMs may miss problems. Imagine you're using the same model to drive a bot that is also being used to analyze it, then there is a risk that a bias in that model will not be detected because the analysis will also have the same bias. So in our platform, for example, we use techniques like consensus polling, where we allow more than one model to actually make a judgment to try and avoid some of these potential biases.
Next question. In your talk, you were quite dismissive of the ability of bots and IVRs to meet customers' emotional needs because they will know that they are speaking with a machine. What if the customer doesn't know it's a machine?
That's a good question. Firstly, there's very strong evidence that people do personify almost all user interfaces and bring their emotional baggage along with them when they interact with the machine. If a machine could emulate a person perfectly, then they would likely achieve the same or similar emotional outcomes than a person would, particularly if the person doesn't know that they're speaking to a machine. But you can fool some of the people some of the time, particularly with chat conversations, but you can't fool everyone. And consider the emotional impact to a caller discovering that they're actually interacting with a machine, having been fooled into thinking that it was a person. That's not really a journey that many companies would choose to take. So for this reason, and a few ethical ones as well, it's my firm opinion that customers should always know when they're speaking with a machine or a person.
Thank you, David. Next question. Can you tell me more about the agent assist idea? I know that there are products that listen in on the conversation and pop up suggestions to the agent. Is that what you were talking about?
Well, that's certainly one aspect of AI for Agent Assist. As you say, there are products that do this today. They tend to use simple word spotting and handcrafted rules at the moment to remind agents to do things like validate the customer correctly or ask them their first name or read a compliance statement at the right moment. This is one of the use cases I was picturing for LLM-based Agent Assist, and it will be conceptually very similar, but just a lot more effective. It's also possible we might see the emergence of agent-monitored bot conversations. So in that model, the customer believes they're speaking with a machine, but there is a person actually monitoring each step or maybe later steps as the conversation gets more involved and approving them. So the person can intervene or correct at any time. This model's already used in the IVR world with human agents monitoring the progress of automated spoken conversations to make sure they stay on track. It means that a single agent can monitor multiple conversations simultaneously and therefore vastly increases their efficiency. The beauty of this model is that we have the agent doing the assurance in real time, which dramatically reduces the risk of fallout if the bot does something wrong, and therefore you can be more adventurous in how you actually use your bots in the first place.
Thank you, David. Last question we have. Will there ever be a time when people are not needed for customer assistance?
Well, my honest answer is I don't know. If you'd asked me 5 years ago whether automation could do the things that LLMs are doing today, I would have confidently told you no. So I may not be the right person to ask, but I think that AI will grow rapidly in the next decade. But I do doubt that people are going to be totally squeezed out the process. I've always believed that true progress towards AI is going to come from machines learning in much the same way that people learn. And it is very likely that we'll see major advances in this area in the next decade. One thing I have noticed during the last 20 years or so is a demographic difference in how people try to solve customer service problems and also their choice of channels. It's not strictly generational, but as an approximation, it seems that millennials and after that have a totally different expectation of what customer service looks like. They're much more likely to try and self-serve using a digital channel, and they are much more likely to engage with chat for assistance rather than place a phone call. So if we combine the two trends of rapidly advancing AI and this demographic trend, I do think that there was going to be significant reduction in the need of people to do what we think of as traditional customer service today. I do, however, believe that there will always be a need for customers to reach someone who can empathize with their situation and actually take ownership of a problem.
Thank you, David. We have one last question, extra question just came in. What's your opinion on obfuscating the fact that a customer is speaking with a bot to solicit better customer engagement to avoid immediate jumps to speak with a human or deliberate vague responses? Interesting question.
I guess we've answered this to some extent in that I do believe that customers should always know when they're speaking with a human or a machine. So I would discourage this as a behavior. It's been something that's been tried in the IVR world. So essentially conning customers into thinking that it's not a machine so that they'll engage with it. But the problem is that the impact on the customer when they discover that it really is a machine is just too negative. So I would suggest that you don't do it. Having said that, though, for these blended models where, for example, with a bot, if you can manage the transition over to a person in such a way that it never becomes obvious that they weren't speaking to a person in the first place, it might be worth trying. But you have to be very, very sure that essentially the curtain's never going to slip. Because if it does, you're probably going to end up with quite a strong negative perception backlash at those moments.
Well, David, thank you so much for all the preparation in the webinar today. And thank you to the audience for submitting questions ahead of time and during the webinar. To learn more about TalkMap, as always, please visit talkmap.com. To schedule a demo, please visit talkmap.com/schedule a demo. And we'll see you on the next event. Thanks so much.
Thank you.